They called 911 on me, right in my own office. Said I was violating HOA rules. Said they had full authority over the building. I didn't laugh, not yet. I was too stunned to respond. I had just arrived like any other morning, coffee in hand, unlocking the glass door to my office suite. I noticed a couple of HOA board members walking toward me, clipboards in hand. That already told me something was off. Usually they ignore me. Today, they looked determined. One of them, a woman named Carol, raised her voice before I could even say good morning. "You can't be here until you fix the signage violation," she said, pointing toward a banner I had on the inside of my window. It was a simple sign. My company name, our slogan, nothing flashy. Just the standard stuff any business would display. I blinked, still standing in the doorway. "Excuse me?" I said. She stepped closer and told me my banner violated the aesthetic standards of the complex, that it needed approval, that the HOA had sent me 3 letters already. Now I check my mail. I read every email. I had received nothing, not a single notice. And even if I had that banner, it was protected under the lease terms, which, in this case, I wrote myself, because I don't rent here. I own it. Still, I was calm. I told them politely that I hadn't received any letters and that I'd be happy to discuss the issue. But I also mentioned that as a property owner, I had rights that might override their claims. That was apparently the trigger. Carol stepped back, scoffing. The man beside her, Greg, pulled out his phone. "We're done talking. If you won't comply, we'll let the police handle this." I raised an eyebrow. "You're calling 911 because I opened my own office door?" I said, dead serious. He didn't answer. He just walked away while dialing. Now picture that. I'm standing in front of my own business. I've paid for the land, the structure, the taxes, the renovations. I'm holding keys to every office in the building. And some HOA board members, who only manage the residential side next door, are calling the police on me. A few nearby tenants came out, hearing the noise. One woman shook her head and muttered, "They're always like this." Another laughed quietly and said, "They try to find me for leaving a delivery box out overnight." It took less than 5 minutes for a patrol car to show up. The officer stepped out, clearly expecting some kind of altercation. I stood there, hands in my pockets, calm as ever. Carol practically ran over to him, waving her hands, talking fast. "He's violating our rules. He's ignoring legal notices. He's putting unauthorized signage on common property." The officer turned to me. "Sir, do you own this office?" I nodded and pulled out a folder I had brought for a meeting later that day. And it was a copy of the title, my property deed, the entire HOA agreement for the neighboring complex, and the zoning laws. I handed it to him wordlessly. He looked through the paperwork for a minute, then glanced back at Carol. "Ma'am, this office complex is not under your HOA's jurisdiction," he said flatly. "These are commercial units. Your bylaws stop at the property line." Carol's face went pale. Greg muttered something about checking with the board. The officer returned my documents and told me I was free to go about my business. I thanked him. He nodded and drove off. But even then, I could tell this wasn't over. They didn't apologize. They didn't back down. Instead, Carol turned to me one more time and said, "We'll be following up with legal." I smiled. "Please do. I'll forward it to my lawyer, who also rents an office right upstairs." They walked away without another word, and I went inside, logged into my computer, sipped my coffee, and started typing up a little story I thought the internet might want to hear. It didn't start with a banner, though that was just the latest excuse. This HOA had been trying to control everything around here for months. First, it was the trash bins. Then it was where delivery trucks could park. Now, they were acting like they had legal say over how I ran my office, one they didn't even have jurisdiction over. Let me explain how this setup works. The HOA manages the residential neighborhood that sits directly next to my commercial complex. There's a row of houses, a small park, and a clubhouse. On paper, their borders end right where the commercial zone begins. And yet, over time, they started pushing further, setting rules, trying to enforce them outside their territory. Most business owners didn't argue. Some didn't even realize the HOA had no authority over them. Others were too busy running things to fight back. But I had the time, and I had the paperwork to prove it. When I bought the complex, I didn't just buy one office. I bought the land. Every unit in the building is legally mine. I lease them to professionals, a therapist, an accountant, a graphic designer, but I handle everything: maintenance, signage, parking, security. And nowhere in any legal document is there a clause that hands control over to the HOA next door. But they tried anyway. About 6 months ago, they left a flyer taped to my window. Said they were updating community rules and that commercial tenants would now need to submit design plans for approval. That included window decals, signs, and exterior lighting. I tossed it in the trash. It wasn't binding. It wasn't even addressed to me by name. A few weeks later, one of my tenants said an HOA rep came by unannounced and told them to remove their security camera. Claimed it was disturbing the visual integrity of the complex. That's when I realized this wasn't just a one-time overstep. They were trying to gain control by acting like they already had it. So I did what any smart business owner would do. I had my attorney draft a formal cease and desist letter outlining the limits of their authority. I included documentation, parcel boundaries, zoning maps, titles, everything that clearly stated the HOA's powers ended at the property line. I hand-delivered the letter to their office. They didn't respond. Not directly, anyway. Instead, they doubled down. A month later, they put up new signs near the entrance to my complex. The signs read, "All businesses must comply with community standards. Fines will apply." They planted them right along the sidewalk, making it look like those rules applied to my tenants too. I had those signs removed the same day. Then a notice showed up on one of my tenants' doors. It claimed she was being fined for unauthorized window coverings. She called me in a panic. Thinking she was in trouble, I had to walk her through the fact that the HOA couldn't fine her. Not for anything. Not unless she let them. I knew what this was. It wasn't about signage or cameras. It was about control. The HOA board was made up of a handful of residents who thought they ran the block. And when they saw a business complex they didn't own, they decided to act like they did. It all built up slowly, like a pot starting to boil. First it was paper notices, then unannounced visits, eventually confrontations, and finally a 911 call over a banner in my own window. It's funny in a way. They could have asked questions. They could have worked with me. But they chose to pretend they were in charge. That everyone had to fall in line just because they said so. They made a mistake, though. They assumed no one would push back. But I've owned buildings before. Dealt with cities, permits, zoning boards. This wasn't new to me, and I wasn't about to let a self-appointed committee boss me around. So when that officer told them they had no say, I already knew that was coming. I had prepared for it. I just hoped it wouldn't get that far. But sometimes people need to hear it from someone in uniform before they listen. Still, something about that day told me they weren't done. You could see it in their faces. That mix of shock and pride. Like they couldn't believe they lost control and weren't ready to accept it yet. They showed up again the next morning. Same people. Same clipboards. But this time, they had reinforcements. 2 more board members, both looking like they meant business. They didn't say hello, didn't ask to talk. They just walked the property like it belonged to them, pointing at things and whispering like they were building a case. I stayed inside and watched from the lobby window. I had security cameras, too, recording every move. I wasn't about to confront them right away. Let them look. Let them assume. I wanted to see just how far they thought they could push their luck after what happened with the police. Eventually, Carol knocked on the door. She didn't smile, just waved a paper in her hand and said, "We need to speak with the property manager." I opened the door slowly and replied, "You're speaking to the owner." She blinked, clearly still not used to hearing that. "We've identified multiple violations," she said, like she was reading off a script. Non-compliant signage, unapproved window tinting, unpermitted exterior lighting, and an obstruction in the emergency access lane. I looked at her and calmly asked, "Do you believe your HOA has legal authority over this commercial complex?" She hesitated. "The community guidelines apply to all adjacent properties." I didn't let her finish. "That's incorrect. I've already provided you with parcel maps, titles, and legal statements. You are not my governing body." She tried to hand me the paper, but I didn't take it. "I don't accept notices from organizations that have no jurisdiction over me," I said plainly. Greg stepped up behind her. "We're going to take this to the city," he warned. I smiled. "Good, because the city already approved everything you're pointing at. I have copies of the permits for the lighting and the emergency lane, which, by the way, your residents have been blocking with their cars for weeks." That shut him up for a second. Carol's tone changed. "Look, we're just trying to maintain community standards." "That's fine," I replied, "but this isn't your community. This is my property, and I don't answer to you." They finally backed off, but not before muttering something about consulting a lawyer. I closed the door and walked straight to my office, pulled out a fresh folder, started printing every permit, inspection report, zoning approval, and title deed again. This time, I wasn't going to wait for them to show up. I was taking it to their board. That afternoon, I delivered a formal notice to the HOA's office. I included everything: marked up maps, copies of all documents, a letter from my attorney stating their interference had crossed into harassment. I made it clear any further attempts to enforce rules outside their jurisdiction would be met with legal action. I handed it to the secretary and walked away. Calm, direct, professional. But I wasn't done yet. Later that week, I started hearing from my tenants. Apparently, HOA members have been approaching them directly, warning them not to trust me, telling them I was lying about ownership, that I was operating illegally, trying to scare them into compliance. One tenant, a therapist who had been renting from me for almost 2 years, was visibly upset. "They said I might lose my license if I don't fix my signage," she told me. "But I haven't done anything wrong." She hadn't. None of them had. The HOA was trying to poison the well, make my tenants fear the people who were supposed to have no authority over them. That's when I decided to host a meeting. I invited every tenant to a lunch in the conference room, brought in food, set up a projector, and I laid everything out: maps, documents, the legal structure of ownership. I explained what an HOA can and cannot do. I showed them how our property lines were clearly separated from the residential zone. Then I made a promise. You run your businesses, and I'll protect this building. If anyone approaches you from the HOA, send them to me. You don't answer to them. You answer to your lease, and I wrote that lease. The relief in that room was visible. People relaxed. They laughed. Some even shared their own run-ins with HOA board members. We bonded over the ridiculousness of it all. But I knew it still wasn't over. This wasn't about confusion anymore. This was pride, ego, control. They couldn't stand the fact that someone nearby didn't play by their rules. And even when the police and paperwork told them no, they were looking for another way to force the outcome they wanted. About a week later, I noticed something strange. City code enforcement showed up at my building. Not just passing by, they parked, got out, and started inspecting, measuring distances between parking spots, checking light fixtures, even taking pictures of my ADA-compliant ramps. I knew instantly this wasn't random. Somebody had made a complaint. I stepped outside and greeted them. One of the inspectors introduced herself and said they were following up on an anonymous report regarding multiple compliance concerns. She was polite but thorough. She mentioned violations I had already addressed months ago, things that had already passed final inspection when I renovated the place. I didn't argue. I offered copies of permits, showed her exactly what was in place, what had been approved, and what was fabricated. She nodded, took notes, and said they'd follow up once their internal check was complete. But I already knew where this came from. It wasn't subtle. The HOA had gone to the city to try a different angle. If they couldn't control me directly, they'd try to get me tangled up in red tape. This wasn't surprising. It was actually a classic tactic. Create noise, make it difficult, frustrate people until they either give up or fall in line. But what they didn't know was that I played this game before, and I always kept receipts. By that evening, I had already called my architect and had copies of every inspection approval sent to my email. My attorney confirmed that if this continued without cause, we have grounds for legal harassment. I was stacking documentation like armor. The more they tried, the more prepared I became. 2 days later, I got another knock on my office door. This time it wasn't the HOA, it was a delivery guy, but he had something strange. A packet. Inside, a formal complaint filed by the HOA's attorney. It accused me of creating a public nuisance, of installing unapproved external lighting that disturbed residential quality of life. They also alleged that I allowed tenants to host unauthorized public events, which, as far as I could tell, referred to the tenant meetings inside our own building. It was absurd. I called their lawyer directly, asked if he had seen the parcel zoning map. Silence. Then a stammered explanation that he was acting on the information provided by the HOA board. I told him to expect a response from my attorney, and I hung up. But here's the part that really got me. The HOA had been mailing copies of this complaint to other nearby businesses, ones that didn't even rent from me, just trying to stir things up. Try to make it look like I was some rogue operator, making life hard for the neighborhood. That's when I realized this wasn't just about rules or property lines anymore. This was personal. They weren't trying to enforce order. They were trying to make an example out of me, show the rest of the block what happens when you don't obey. But they underestimated something crucial. I don't fold under pressure. I get louder. The very next morning, I posted a public notice on the front of my building, framed, laminated. It listed the exact property lines, ownership titles, and a line-by-line explanation of how the HOA's authority ended at the adjoining sidewalk. I added a QR code that linked to a digital folder with all the official documents and permits. I kept it classy, clean, and undeniable. People started talking. Not just tenants, other property owners nearby. They were curious. Some had quietly felt the same pressure from the HOA, but hadn't known how to fight it. I started getting emails. Quiet thanks. Even a few requests for legal referrals. It wasn't about causing drama. It was about holding the line. If they could do this to me, someone who owns the entire complex, what chance did the little guy have? The funny thing is, once you make noise with facts, people start listening. Even the city. Within a few days, I received a follow-up from code enforcement. Everything was approved. The file was closed. There were no violations, and the city was satisfied with the current status of the property. No fine, no correction orders, nothing, just confirmation that I was fully compliant. And the complaint had no standing. I printed that letter and added it to the display on the front door. The next time they showed up, they didn't bother knocking. I saw them from the security feed. 3 board members standing just outside the main entrance, arguing among themselves. One of them had a thick binder tucked under his arm. Another was on the phone, pacing back and forth with her hand pressed hard against her ear. They looked tense, less confident than before, almost cornered. I didn't move. I just watched. They eventually walked off, but not before one of them snapped a few photos of the front of the building, including the public notice I had posted by the door. They didn't remove it. They didn't touch it. They just looked at it like it had defeated them without saying a word. Still, I knew they weren't done. The next surprise came through email. An invitation sent to me and all the business owners on the block to a community standards alignment meeting hosted by the HOA. No location listed at first, just a date, time, and a very bold subject line, protecting the character of our shared spaces. I didn't reply, but I called around, spoke to a few other property owners. Some had gotten the same message. Some hadn't. The ones who did were all either directly adjacent to the HOA's boundary or had previously refused to follow some odd directive. It was clear they were targeting people, not informing, not collaborating, targeting. A few days later, the location was revealed. The meeting was set to be held inside the HOA clubhouse, which made it clear who was controlling the narrative. I decided to go, not to argue, not to fight, just to listen. When I arrived, the room was already half full. Residents sat on one side, mostly nodding along to the slideshow. Community preservation, aesthetic consistency, shared responsibility, all the usual buzzwords floated across the screen. But then the tone shifted. A slide came up showing blurry photos of commercial buildings, one of them mine. A man stood up front, someone I'd never seen before. He introduced himself as a community outreach consultant, hired by the HOA to facilitate better cooperation between homeowners and neighboring businesses. It didn't take long for the message to become clear. He wasn't here to listen. He was here to pressure. They spoke about how nearby businesses should respect the visual harmony of the community, how lighting from office buildings was impacting neighborhood rest, and how non-compliant advertising could bring down property values. Then someone in the crowd raised a hand, an older gentleman who owned a car detailing shop a few doors down from my place. "So," he said slowly, "are you saying these businesses fall under your HOA?" The presenter paused. "We're saying the community benefits when everyone aligns with our guidelines." The man shook his head. "That's not what I asked." A few murmurs broke out in the room. I wasn't the only one who noticed the dodge. That's when I stood up. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I just asked one question. "Can you show us the legal documentation that gives the HOA authority over any commercial property outside its defined boundary?" Silence. No slides. No answers. So I followed up. "I own my building. I own the land it's on. I have the zoning approval, the permits, and the title records. You've sent letters, notices, complaints. And now you're holding meetings as if your rules extend beyond your legal reach. Do you have a map? Something, anything, to support what you're trying to enforce?" Still nothing. The consultant shuffled some papers, but never responded. And then, just like that, a few business owners began standing up. They started asking questions, too. One of them even asked if the HOA had received funding or donations tied to certain properties. Another wanted to know how the HOA justified the use of its legal budget to chase complaints outside its community. The energy shifted fast. This wasn't their crowd anymore. The meeting fizzled after that. No clear answers, no resolutions. The board members looked uncomfortable. And for the first time, I saw something different in their posture, not arrogance, but uncertainty. That night, I got 2 emails. One from a nearby salon owner thanking me for standing up, the other from a board member, this time much more carefully worded, suggesting a collaborative meeting to establish boundaries and mutual respect. Interesting, I thought. Now they want to talk. I didn't respond to their email right away. I let it sit, not out of spite, but because I wanted to see what they'd do when they didn't get the reaction they expected. These weren't people used to being ignored. HOA board members like this are used to being the loudest voice in the room. So when silence is what they're met with, it shakes them a bit. Sure enough, 3 days later, I saw Carol again. This time, she was standing outside my office building alone. No clipboard, no entourage, just her, standing near the posted documents like she was reading them for the first time. I walked out and stood beside her. We didn't say anything at first. She stared at the zoning map laminated on my front door. Then she finally broke the silence. "You've really done your homework." I nodded. You'd be surprised how motivating paperwork becomes when someone keeps trying to tell you what to do with your own property. She turned to me. "We weren't trying to cause trouble. We just thought if we didn't act quickly, this area would change too fast. Too much lighting. Too much signage. People started complaining." I let her talk. I could hear it in her voice, that hint of defensiveness masked as concern. But I didn't let her off easy. "Change isn't always a threat," I said. "Sometimes it's progress. What matters is if that change respects the law, and I've made sure every single thing I've done here is by the book." She sighed. "We didn't realize how serious you were about all this." That part made me laugh. Not in a mocking way, just at the absurdity of it all. Of course I'm serious. This isn't a hobby. This is my livelihood, my investment. I didn't buy a strip mall. I built a business hub. She didn't argue, just nodded slowly and said, "Maybe we started off on the wrong foot." It was the closest thing to an apology I'd heard since this entire mess began. And while I wasn't in a rush to forgive, I could tell something had shifted. The fight they thought they wanted had become far more complex than expected. But here's the part they never understood from the beginning. I didn't need their approval. I didn't build this property to match their vision. I built it because the community needed a space that worked. Tenants needed offices. Locals needed access to services. And no one needed more layers of regulation from a board that couldn't see past shrub placement and mailbox design. The next day, I hosted another tenant lunch. This one was more relaxed. We talked about marketing ideas, small upgrades we could make to the building, maybe repainting the back wall. A few new tenants had joined recently. People who had heard about what was going on and wanted to be part of something outside the HOA's grip. One of them, a young woman who ran a small tech startup, said something that stuck with me. It's weird. I feel like this place is personality, not just compliance. That's what they never got. Personality. Identity. The idea that a place can function well without fitting into someone else's tiny idea of what's acceptable. That's what the HOA had been trying to erase. Anything that didn't look like it was cut from their template. But the more they pushed, the more this place pushed back. My tenants felt it. My neighbors felt it. Even the people who never said anything started to notice. The atmosphere was changing. The funny part? The HOA began backing off, slowly but noticeably. No more letters. No more random inspections. No more legal suggestions. It's like they realized they'd drawn more attention to themselves by trying to control something they never owned in the first place. A few weeks later, I got a knock from someone I didn't expect. One of the original board members who used to stand next to Carol during their early confrontations. He handed me a manila envelope. "This is just for your records," he said. Inside were copies of all the complaints withdrawn. Statements of no further action. Basically a full retreat, dressed up in formal language, but a retreat nonetheless. I thanked him, not smugly, just respectfully, because while I didn't need their validation, I knew what this moment meant. They finally understood. It was almost peaceful after that. No more random knocks on the door. No more strange cars circling the lot taking photos. No more vague complaints from people who never once stepped inside the building. For the first time in months, I could walk through my own property without feeling like I was being watched or measured against rules that didn't apply. Tenants noticed too. A few of them had quietly pulled me aside in the past, asking if I was planning to sell or relocate. But now, those same people were putting up new signs, expanding their services, and even recommending my complex to others. One guy, a family counselor who rented a small suite near the back, told me his client appreciated how calm and private the place felt. That one stuck with me, because it hadn't felt calm before. It had felt like I was under siege. Like every square inch of my office space was being scrutinized for imperfections no one actually cared about, except the people obsessed with control. But now, things were shifting. Not just in the air, in the numbers too. The waiting list for space in my complex had grown. I'd gone from a few hesitant inquiries to a full inbox of small business owners asking if I had any rooms left. Word had spread that this place wasn't just professionally run. It was protected, secure, and not just physically, but legally and mentally. Tenants knew they didn't have to deal with nonsense here. They could focus on what mattered. Still, I didn't fully relax. That's not how I'm built. I kept tabs on everything, reviewed my leases, rechecked my permits, had my attorney run a quiet search to make sure no new legal actions had been filed against my property or business. I even upgraded my security system, not out of fear, but as a reminder that while the storm had passed, the clouds weren't necessarily gone forever. And then something interesting happened. A representative from another nearby complex came to visit, a guy named Jordan, who ran an older commercial plaza just 2 blocks away. He asked to grab coffee, said he'd been watching the drama unfold, and wanted to ask a few questions. Not out of gossip, but curiosity. Over that coffee, he explained that his tenants had been getting subtle pressure too. Flyers placed under their doors. Community standard reminders that didn't quite make sense. And a few even had their businesses listed in HOA newsletters as local concerns, a term that sounded polite but was clearly a red flag. He wanted to know how I handled it. Not just what I said, but how I made it stop. So I told him everything. From the very first day, they challenged my right to be there, all the way to the official withdrawal letters. I showed him my documentation system, shared some of the wording I used, even gave him the contact info from my zoning consultant. He looked relieved, not because he expected to copy my playbook perfectly, but because he realized he wasn't alone, that this creeping overreach wasn't just happening to me. It was part of a pattern. A week later, I got word that Jordan had begun posting his own boundary notices. Polite, professional, but firm. He even put up a business-owned property sign at the front of his lot, much like I had done. What I didn't expect was the ripple effect. More commercial owners started speaking up, not just nearby, but across the city. Some contacted me directly, saying they'd seen the incident online or heard about it through colleagues. A small business coalition invited me to speak at their monthly meeting. Me, the guy who just wanted to be left alone to run an office building. That meeting was eye-opening. Turns out, there were dozens of us, maybe hundreds, dealing with the same kind of slow-burn intimidation from overreaching HOAs. Different tactics, same intent. Control without authority. But once you shine a light on it, people stop whispering. They start pushing back. I never planned to become a symbol of resistance. I just wanted to protect what I built. But now it was bigger than me. The fight I fought became a signal to others. You're not crazy. You're not wrong. And most importantly, you're not alone.